So I wanted to talk to you about the limits of affirmation, the limits of speaking about gender identity and how those two go together. And by consequence also the limits of being called, summoned constantly into the idea of trans joy. Now I've said limits here. I've not said there's no place for that. But when that becomes the center of trans rights and discourse, reivindication, affirmation of gender identity, trans women are women, trans men are men, gender euphoria, and all that kind of thing, then what is being left out? Multiple dimensions of people's lives as trans women and men, as trans individuals, are not pictures of joy, whilst resilience and survivance, that is, survival and resistance, are important dimensions to our stories. It is quite a stretch to only publicly project an image of things like success, mere affirmation, and positivity, when so many things that affect our communities actually demonstrate the opposite and should be the basis of calls for quote-unquote trans rights. But my feeling is we should be using the word trans justice, because all of what I've just mentioned is kind of trapped by both neoliberal and liberal discourses. And as usual, those most affected within our communities are those that are racialized, that are First Nations, that are working class, that are poor, that are shut out of access, that need social services, that are left in the gaps, that also have mental health conditions and disabilities. Now, there's some conversation about being trans and having disabilities, obviously. But I really do think that the context of vulnerability for, in particular, trans women are under-addressed, particularly those of us who work within the sex trade, who cannot find gainful employment otherwise, and those of us who live with the legacies of trauma, intergenerational or otherwise, for First Nations, that we are overrepresented statistically in terms of having a history of CSA, and I can put some stats down below, and that leaves a real burden on us. Now, trauma itself can be invoked by a lack of familial acceptance, right, and societal rejection. And maybe for those of us born this side of the century, all these affirmation discourses have seemingly created a pretty picture, but that's largely for the middle class and for the white members of our community. I'm not saying that struggles and pain can't also be experienced by, and dysphoria by, such individuals. But the question of access is differentially managed. So housing insecurity, homelessness, running awry of the law, being policed, spending times in court pleading at sentencing hearings for leniency, being put in solitary confinement because of a brush with the police, where you're accused of being the aggressor when the police themselves were the aggressors. These sorts of stories do not make it into the trans joy mainstream, and are also not commonly foregrounded as part of that spectrum of rights, well, let's say justice, that trans people want to see in the world. How can we begin to live lives fully as the people that we are, enjoying the rights that everyone else has, when systemically there are these forms of harm and mistreatment and devaluation as well. So much gets lost in the conversations, and especially in the age of the algorithm and the us versus them, the idea that trans people writ large, which always sums up the image of someone who is somehow an aggressive person that wants to take over women's space, was some kind of image of a trans person that's categorical, that wants to inflict harm on women, for example, is in stark contradiction to the realities that I've just mentioned about policing, about facing court, about not having proper access to social and housing services, about having to battle with trauma, including complex trauma, about being also discriminated against on the basis of your perceived race or your status as First Nations, early childhood experiences, adverse ones, abuse, and so on. These sorts of things rarely get invoked in discussions about so-called trans rights. Maybe housing does, maybe health, maybe even employment, but there's a lot of us left behind. And I just think the conversation needs to change. People have to know more about our lives, the patterns of, for example, gendered and gender-based violence that start quite early, actually. Because basically we're having to contend with a settler colonial gender order. And that affects all sorts of people, not just trans women. It also affects so-called cis women, women in general, particularly black women. I just think we need to imagine trans justice otherwise, and also to find effective ways to tell our stories, come together, see where they overlap. Because of course there are privileges, including myself. But I'm not going to say that my experiences, therefore, are the experiences of all trans people. I'm more interested in listening intently and advocating for and fighting for those who continually get left out of the conversation, or even the imaginary of what being a trans person, trans woman, is. So obvious here to me is the realities that sister girls live through. And not only is this not a matter of interest to researchers, it would seem, but also within so-called community spaces, and even within roles. For instance, imagine that you've been able to establish a profile for yourself, notwithstanding barriers to education as well, that's another important area, and become a sex worker advocate in organisations like SWAP, getting experience in that terrain within the not-for-profit sector, and being gainfully employed. I don't see a lot of openings for sister girls, and I also see a syndrome in which people can get shunned from those spaces, with the usual problematic tropes of having problems with alcohol. Any number of us can have forms of addiction when we have survived multiple forms of violence, whether in community, within family, within white racist society and carceral society. What we need here is a different paradigm for trans justice, which includes emphasizing mental health and infrastructures of care. In the words of Miss Major, you can't have political action without that care. I'll put her quote down below because I haven't actually quoted it exactly. Looking to black trans women and like trans feminisms is really important in this regard, but also trans leaders in this very country like Crystal Love. So that's my thoughts for today, and I hope that you get something out of them.